Today on the Missions Podcast, what gives missionaries the right to go to other people groups and tell them that Jesus is the only way to God?
Man is inherently evil. He is not good. We taught the Yembi Yembis 14 years ago that message that we are separated from God and that your ancestors were separated from God, just like my ancestors were. And then God actually provides a way through Jesus Christ, through sending the God man to reconcile us to him. And through his death and his resurrection, we actually have access to God. I think that's the part that to believe that you're a sinner and to believe that you're in need of something is just so very foreign to today's context, not just to unbelievers, but also the Christians, I think, in some ways.
We're joined by Brooks Buser, president of Radius International, with an important update. But first, a message from ABWE president Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE, joined again, in case you didn't know, by Scott Dunford, our West Coast mobilizer and lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. And Scott, we have another guest from the West Coast joining us here today that our listeners, those who've been loyal listeners to the show, will recognize as soon as we introduce him and he starts speaking. But Scott, we've been having some conversation lately. It's been an incredible time to even think about world mission. There's such hostility towards the bare idea of not just evangelism. I think that always garners a certain reaction from people coming around saying Jesus is the only way, but taking that message to unreached groups, to people who've never come in contact with the West or with Christianity. I don't know if I remember ever before a time in which publicly that was a less popular thing to do.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I mean, it certainly feels like, we are living in an age in which the thought of evangelism is one of the most offensive thoughts. And there's a lot of good reasons why people would say that, because we shouldn't be that surprised, right? I mean, Paul did clearly articulated the fact that, to some, this is a stench of death. To others, it's the sweetest smell they've ever smelled. And we should expect that that people are going to respond differently. But still, it isn't super, when you're in the receiving end of it, that's not the most fun thing in the world, I'm sure. And so it's good to have Brooks Buser on with us. He's the director and the leader of Radius International. But we're going to kind of just dive in, since we know him well and our listeners should know him well. And we're going to get into a topic that has certainly been thrust on him. But before we do that, I want to set it up a little bit. Brooks, welcome to our show. And particularly, we want to talk a little bit about what's been going on with one particular unreached people group called the Amdu people, and then kind of all that's kind of spun out around that. Can you tell us a little bit before we get started, one, how you're doing, how your family's doing, and then tell us a little bit about what's going on with the Amdu people?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Scott. No, my family's doing well. It's been an interesting last week and a half just in relation to, one particular tweet that got sent out about the Amdu people. By God's grace, the Amdu Church is in existence. About a week and a half ago, they presented the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And those who understood and have made professions of faith are starting to come out, and they're having more and more talks with them. It's pretty neat to see, just in that small little tribal group in the middle of the mountains of Papua New Guinea, God's church is growing and it's going forward. And so we're very, very encouraged by that.
So a simple tweet stirred up a lot of drama. What happened on that thread? And for those of our listeners who aren't in the Twitter sphere, maybe you're not missing anything, but it did expose some things, didn't it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'm no big Twitter guy. I'll just say that at the outset. I've only been on it for about 3 years now. my wife and I came back from Papua New Guinea in 2016. I was encouraged about a year later to have a Twitter account. So I usually just send out quotes of missionaries from different generations, occasionally a Radius article here and there, but that's about it. I'm not a big fan of it. So the Amdu team was getting ready to present the gospel. They had been teaching for 5 months. They've been in that location for over 5 years with the people on site. They have been a tremendous blessing to them. The infant mortality rate has dropped dramatically. They've taught them how to read and write in their own language for the first time in their history. They've introduced different businesses that can be helpful for them long term. And so after all of that, they have started the teaching 5 months ago. And so they let me know via email that they were going to be coming to the actual center of Christianity, the death, burial, and resurrection. And yeah, would we be praying? And so I sent out a tweet just saying, hey, would you consider praying for the Amdu team? They're getting ready to present the most important information that any human being can come across. I obviously didn't say all that in Twitter, but they're going to be presenting the gospel. And
that was a really simple tweet.
Oh, it was incredibly simple.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very Christian, and I think that was part of it.
Yeah.
But there was a great outpouring initially, the first 2 days, of some wonderful Christian brothers and sisters, and I imagine the prayer was just really strong. And so I was very encouraged by that. That was the first few days.
And then,
well, the other half of the story is, and then it started to bring different individuals in. Some of them you could recognize. Some of them are involved in film. Some of them are politicians from other countries. And then there's some from recent movements that have happened socially within the United States in the last few years. And so it started to get some rather strong responses against not only Christianity, but the assumption that COVID was being introduced there, the assumption that they were going to colonize or bring some horrible aspects of Western society in on them. And so, yeah, there's some really, really strong responses. There's different individuals that started trying to find my wife and my son's social media accounts. And there was a lot of strong pushback. And some of that I think is understandable. Like I think you said at the beginning, Scott, the gospel is offensive. It's very offensive to people. And if you rightly understand what's being said, I can understand that. I very much get that. The parts about the health and the welfare, I think they're just really naive or not really understanding what the situation is there. So, yeah, it's been fairly steady. I think it's up near 11,000 retweets now, and it's gotten a ton. I think it's close to 10,000 comments. Most of those are not terribly gracious, but you know what? It's you can't really control much on Twitter.
So your whole life has been in Christian missions of some sort, because your parents were missionaries. You grew up on the mission field. So you've really been your whole entire life connected to foreign missions. I can only imagine that there's been a lot of changes over your course of your life as far as how people responded to you and your family and your involvement in missions. What just help our listeners, especially our younger listeners that are listening, what changes have you seen in the way that missionaries and missions is simply perceived and talked about, and even how people are responding to you when they find out you're involved in Christian missions?
Yeah, I'd say it really depends on if they are Christians or if they are not Christians, if they're unbelievers. Christians still, for the most part, understand Matthew 28, 19, and 20, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, Acts 1:8, to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Christians understand that. That's the DNA of a Christian. Those are the final marching orders of our King, of Jesus Christ, that we take his message, we take the story of him and what he did for mankind, rescuing us from our sins. We take that message to everyone who hasn't heard. And then it's their choice whether they believe or they don't believe. That's not forced on them, but that's one aspect of it. I think Christians still, Bible-believing Christians still resonate with that. We need to do that. That's who we are as the people of God. I think unbelievers, increasingly, that is a very it's something that is very opposed to their worldview, that somehow I need help, that somehow the innocent man, and I say that, you can't see my air quotes, the innocent man in Africa, the innocent man in Papua New Guinea, why would he need Christianity? Why is this message important? Why would you go over there and disturb his perfectly peaceful life. The irony is that if you met these people, if you lived among them, like you said, I from 2 years old to 18, then I came back here and got a business degree in college, and then went back and did 13 years. Every people group that I have been among in those circumstances, for one, they've been inviting the missionaries to come in because they recognize that their life gets better. And their infant mortality rate, like I mentioned earlier, the airfields that are built, the commerce that is included. And then there's this talk that somehow changes the way some in the village understand life and they understand death. Christianity does change culture. That's so true. It changes cultures, but it changes them for the better. And that's where misguided, I would say unbelievers who don't understand that, like you quoted at the beginning, 2 Corinthians 2:15, to some Christianity is the aroma of death, but to others, the aroma of life. And so only God knows who is going to understand his message. But by God's grace, we still go, no matter who believes and who is actually in favor of what's going on in those contexts.
Now, a follow-up question. The Christian message of Jesus as savior from sin, his life, his death, his resurrection, his rule over the universe, over humankind, that message does receive one of two reactions that you just described, right? Embrace or hostility. But we also are finding, and you've talked around it already, that even within those who would call themselves Christians, even within what seems to be the church, the idea of going to these frontier peoples, these peoples without a lot of outside contact, and bringing that message and saying, this is the only way, you need to turn from your old ways and embrace Christianity. That is, well, let me rephrase this as a question. Is that a view, being hostile towards missions, that is getting into the church? We just had a conversation the other night with Neil Shenvi discussing post-colonial theory, really, which threatens to dismiss all of missions as merely colonialism, rather than trying to take the good and spit out the bad, thinking about the baggage of colonialism. Are you seeing that more people in the church are embracing that sort of a viewpoint?
I think so. I think a lot of that, unfortunately, comes down to churches and how they're taught. And to be honest, their biblical literacy, their understanding of the scriptures, their understanding of why the church exists. If somebody doesn't understand that the church exists for the gospel and the movement of the gospel to unsaved people groups, they're really not going to understand missions. A lot of people see Christianity, unfortunately, as what it does for them. And while it does save them from their sins, we're never called to let it rest just with us. We're called to be the people that take this message, that continue to evangelize, that continue to move this out. I had a brother send me a clip just the other day. I don't know if you're familiar with Penn and Teller. They're the magician there in Vegas. And there was this really interesting clip that you can find it on YouTube about anywhere. Just Google Penn Teller and Bible. And he finished up a show, and a Christian came up to him afterwards, and the guy was obviously nervous, and he handed him a Bible and he gave him the gospel, and he was obviously nervous. But it was interesting. Penn's reaction to this was, how much do you have to hate somebody to believe that they're going to hell without the gospel and not tell them? And I just thought that was incredible, because Penn is he's a devout atheist. But if we believe we have the truth, if we believe that someone who is not reconciled to God goes to a Christless eternity, goes to a horrible, horrible eternity of pain and suffering, how much do we have to not dislike people, but to just be apathetic, to not give them that message, not only for those who have access, but especially for those that don't have access, the ones that are way, way out in those foreign places. Anyways, I'm getting on a tangent there.
No, it's a good tangent. It's one. Let's continue. We do need to talk about why the gospel does alienate people, but also how we can learn from this as believers as we think about what is our obligation. And we want to hear more about what's happening at Radius, who we know and love here at the show. We're going to hear about all of that from Brooks Buser, president of Radius International, right after these short messages.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunford, and I'd like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or His people. Furthermore, as ministry leaders, our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed last year to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and their good work at abuseprevention.org. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Pray for them and follow along for this accreditation program coming soon.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture, and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long years and even decades-long witness in that culture? And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org, radiusinternational.org.
And we're back with Brooks Buser, president of Radius International. And, Scott, we've spent some time talking about the gospel itself being offensive, but missions itself is something that also lends to a lot of misunderstanding, right?
Oh, sure. And I would love, we saw that in that Twitter thread, and I'm sure we're going to see it after this one comes out too. But before we talk about the offense of the gospel itself, and we've started that conversation already, but what are some of the misunderstandings you've encountered about what missions actually is? I mean, what are some of those things that you feel like people who don't understand the Christian mission, you've addressed it a little bit about what you've seen, but let's elaborate on that more. What are some of the other things that you've seen that people just really misunderstand what missionaries do?
Yeah, I think missions has become about anything and everything in the Christian world today. As long as you're doing it with a stranger outside of your home, that's you're a missionary, and that's a mission field. I think that's a really bad view. There was an excellent article that came out from Founders Ministries just a few days ago by E.D. Burns. I forget title was. It was
I Disagree with Spurgeon was the name of it. I remember it. I just, by the way, ED, if you're listening, ED sent me a copy of his book. Scott, we've got to get one in your hands. Okay. But he's been writing some fantastic stuff. Really helpful.
Yeah, the article was excellent, just explaining not everybody's a missionary and not everywhere is a mission field. That the same analogy he used for pastors. If everyone who is a Christian is a missionary, then the same logic would apply that everyone who is a Christian is also a pastor. And that's just not true. We would never say that because we understand the distinctiveness of pastoral ministry. But missions has kind of become this big lump. I think the other misconception that's really it's strong out there is that somehow the heathen, the people who do not understand and who never have access to the gospel, God will somehow make another way so that they can go to heaven. And that's just a misconception. That's a misunderstanding of the word of God. That is not true. And so I think that takes away some of the impetus of missions. And so I think that broadness of missions and then the not wanting to, basically becoming a universalist, that everyone will end up in heaven someday, somehow, especially if they've never had access. What kind of a loving God would do that? And that's just not understanding Romans 1. That's not understanding Romans 10 or Romans 15 in any way.
Walk us through this. Everything you're saying is premised on the idea that a good God would send some people to a place of fiery torment and others to a place of eternal reward. Now, we take this for granted often. In our circles, we're Christians who live and breathe and we're engaged in ministry. We do this all the time. That gospel is pretty offensive. Why is that gospel offensive? And walk us through how it is that we actually believe that and share that with others.
Well, I think the gospel is offensive first and foremost because it requires someone to believe that they're actually lost, that they are separated from God, that they were born in their sins, and that separation exists from the time of their birth until their death unless they are reconciled to God. I think that's incredibly offensive, that man is inherently evil. He is not good. I think that runs so countercultural to our society today. And I think that idea, I mean, just going back to when we taught the Yembi Yembis about 14 years ago, that message from Genesis 3, that we are separated from God and that your ancestors were separated from God, just like my ancestors were. That is so counter to the culture that we live in, the stream that we swim in today. And then God actually provides a way through Jesus Christ, through sending the God-man, part of the Godhead, coming to earth to reconcile us to him. And through his death and his resurrection, we actually have access to God. I think that's the part that to believe that you're a sinner and to believe that you're in need of something is just so very foreign to today's context, not just to unbelievers, but also the Christians, I think, in some ways.
Help people understand too. Do missionaries try to trick people into being saved? Do missionaries? I mean, I've heard of these things before. Like the cargo cult. Where maybe in Papua New Guinea, where like the tribal people would understand, like, oh wow, if I become a Christian, then all this stuff gets to me. And in other parts of Asia, they call it rice bowl Christians. Like, hey, if I can do this and that, then maybe I'll get extra monetary benefit. Do missionaries that you know of, and do you see that happening where missionaries are trying to coerce people or bribe people into following Jesus?
Yeah, I've heard of that. Very few people that I know of do that. That's the equivalent of the prosperity gospel here in the United States. And so there is going to be always an element of people that would go out and would try and entice people or use some sort of leverage. I've heard of some abhorrent stories of guys doing things that just are very unscrupulous. They lack ethics, pure and simple, and they definitely don't represent the gospel message. The missionaries that I'm more familiar with are the ones that will present. They'll take the time, number one, to learn the language and the culture of the people. And then as they present Christianity, they present, okay, here's what your ancestors, here's what your fathers taught you, here's what this book and the God that is behind this book, he is saying, you choose one or the other, but it can't be both. The mixture of Christianity with an existing belief system, that's the worst of all, is the veneer of Christianity, the symbolism of it, and yet their existing belief system still is there, and it's the functional guidance for their life. The good missionaries that I know of always present them both and let them choose, but let them choose clearly so that they know clearly which one represents the God of the Bible and which one represents their ancestor stories. And that's how good missionaries, most of the ones that I have been familiar with, have taught these types of people.
Yeah, a good missionary is going to honor the individuals, honor the culture, while still bringing that message of truth of the way of salvation that, as you shared earlier, we're morally obligated to bring. But there is still the rub, right? There is still that pain point that you reach where there is an inevitable conflict. And I think in this upcoming generation, we're going to reach another inevitable point of conflict between a gospel that talks about Christ as the exclusive way to God, and you have to consciously believe, receive him, repent of your sin to be included among his people, and a culture that says you cannot not only hold that view and try to bring it to others and proselytize, you certainly can't do that abroad. So how can we prepare ourselves for that conflict, for that rub? How can we prepare ourselves to be misunderstood? And, is that something that you're focused on at Radius at all?
Yeah, I think as more and more churches teach, like what you said, the exclusivity of the gospel, the exclusivity of Christ and who Jesus Christ claimed to be. A lot of people like to put a lot of baggage on Christianity, like, well, Jesus never said, man, read John 14:6. Read the clarity that Jesus speaks of as that he is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by him. People who understand their Bibles know that this isn't a Christian claim. This is the claims of Jesus Christ himself. He actually makes these claims that he was the only way. And so I think as younger Christians hear that from the pulpit, they hear the way that their pastor teaches and that we love all mankind. We are gentle with everyone, but we understand that Jesus is making a claim that no other religion is making. There is no mixture. There is no halfway point, or everyone will make it there through some other way, or like the unsaved guy in Papua New Guinea who never has a chance to hear, he still goes to a Christless eternity, even though he didn't hear the gospel, because there is only one way. And so that pushes us towards passages like Romans 10:14. How shall they hear unless someone preaches to them? And how shall they preach unless they're sent? We are a sent people. We go to those people because we know they go to a Christless eternity unless the gospel gets there and they repent and are saved.
Yeah, that is a message that I think we have to become more. One, the more we share that message, we're going to run into conflict. And secondly, as we live in a society that doesn't understand that, and really doesn't just that they don't understand it, but that there's an active pushback against that. And there is some of that that's happening in our society as we enter into really a post-Christian society and going like, hey, not only do we not agree with that, but we actively are rejecting it and hating it. We should really be expecting and preparing to be dealing with that. So you're working with students all the time, right? That's your ministry, is training next generation for this kind of ministry. How do you try to prepare young missionaries, and even those who don't end up going into the mission field but just go back to their local churches and serve and engage in evangelism where they're at? How do you prepare people that maybe aren't used to persecution, right? You accept Christ in Iran, you accept Christ in Turkey, you're ready to be disowned by your family. But here in America, we've had it pretty cushy, and even pastors, kind of have been treated with respect for a long time. And now we're finding like, wow, like you just saying whatever all of us in the Christian world go, that's a pretty innocuous tweet, actually a nice tweet, and finding like incredible pushback. How do you prepare people, especially those of us who've been groomed to look for affirmation on social media? How do you prepare us to not to be faithful in spite of that?
Yeah, I think probably the two primary methods that we teach down at Radius is, number one, we look at the example of the early church, the church in the book of Acts, and the suffering that they went through. I think it was Augustine that said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, and just understanding the persecution that comes from Christianity being out there is good persecution. It's a good thing, actually, when God's people are put under the gun, so to speak, for their faith. There's many passages from 1 Peter 2:15 to James 1:1, all the way through the Bible, that the persecution of the saints is actually a very helpful thing to the church. And so we walk them through that biblically. And then the second thing we do is we read a lot of missionary biographies, reading Adoniram Judson's To the Golden Shore, the biography of John Payton, the story of Amy Carmichael and what she did for the Indian people and how she rescued so many of those young children that were to be the sexual slaves for the different religions that were there in India at her time. And just walking them through, these are the ones who came before you generations ago, and the principles that they teach, they're still relevant today. The details of it, the actual way it's going to be worked out in Iran, in North Korea, in Afghanistan are going to be different, but the principles are the same. And so I think the combination of the early church and those missionary biographies, they help our students tremendously in that they ground them in reality. This is what it will look like. This is what it may cost you, and it will be worth it. But those two tools are very beneficial.
Well, give us an update on how things have been going lately at Radius. COVID has thrown everyone for a loop, and your entire ministry has to do with taking young people and bringing them to a foreign context, right? And letting them have limited accessibility to their family. I mean, I'm sure there's logistical difficulties that you had. Obviously, your missiology conference had to go digital earlier in the year, and we're looking forward to being with you in Minneapolis in May, I believe it is, of 2021.
June 25th and 26th.
June.
Yeah, we'll have Mark Dever will be one of the keynote speakers. John Piper and Harshit Singh, a brother from India, will also be there. And then there'll be a handful of the Radius crew that will be speaking as well. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that. COVID has kind of, it's in a weird way, it's been really helpful to the student body. The last class graduated in June. Some of the things that they had to go through to see graduation was very challenging for them. And then our next class had to be postponed for 30 days. So they'll be coming in about 2 weeks now for their training. But there's going to obviously be differences. Mexico has been hit by COVID significantly harder than the United States. But by God's grace, the Mexican government has given us protocols that we can adhere to, and so we can keep teaching and have the school open. We won't have as many visitors for the first few months, that's for sure. But yeah, it's been encouraging. And I would say, I mean, I just wrote an actual article about this. What it has done for young people, it's kind of had that same effect on them that we talked about earlier when persecution hits. People who are in are really in, and people who are on the fence are out. And we've seen our applications actually increase, and we've seen more and more people go, yeah, this is what I want to do. And this is worth my life. And that's okay. That's a good thing. And so they step into it. They step away from their jobs. They step away from whatever dreams they had of living in the United States. They come down, they get training with us, and then they head off. But that COVID element has added a little bit of uneasiness. It's added a little bit of angst, maybe a little bit of fear. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good that they think through this before they head overseas.
So Brooks, how can people connect with you? How can they be praying for you, for the work that's continuing to happen with the Amdu people? And maybe somebody wants to be a student and get conditioned for the difficulties of bringing this message abroad.
Yeah, hey, I don't want to push on the Amdu team too much, so I won't give any contacts for them. But the Radius program, and I mean, if they write to, or if they go to radiusinternational.org, there's a general question box there they can write, and they can ask me, and I can send them information if they need it. But yeah, if they're interested in Radius and what we're doing down there, radiusinternational.org is the website. And yeah, if students are looking, or people are looking to be trained to take the gospel to places like Amdu, to places where there is no gospel message, where they are without any disciples, without any gospel, without any church, most importantly, that's what we train for. That's exclusively what we train for. It's the only thing that we do. And so class of 2021 is over half full now. So I would recommend, if they're contemplating it, to send their applications in fairly soon, because I don't think it'll be too many more months and that will be full. But yeah, that would be the best way to get a hold of us.
Well, and it's our prayer as well that people recognize, what craziness, what is it that would convince someone to trade the comforts, all the accoutrements of life here in the U.S., wherever you are, to go to one of these types of people groups, to live in that kind of a setting. And it's because somebody's convinced to the bone of the reality of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we've got to keep that front and center. That's what we're doing. We're not just humanitarians. We're not just seeking to do mercy ministry or benevolence. We are bringing a message of salvation. So Brooks, thank you for what you're doing for the gospel. Yes. And thank you for what you're doing in joining us on the show today.
No worries, brother. Thanks for having me on again.
It's good to have you.
Indeed.
To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.